Everyone believes himself a priori to be perfectly free, even in his individual actions, and thinks that at every moment he can commence another manner of life, which just means that he can become another person. But a posteriori, through experience, he finds to his astonishment that he is not free, but subjected to necessity, that in spite of all his resolutions and reflections he does not change his conduct, and that from the beginning of his life to the end of it he must carry out the very character which he himself condemns, and, as it were, play the part which he has undertaken to the very end. The world as evil. But if the world is will, it must be a world of suffering. And first, because will itself indicates want, and its grasp is always greater than its reach. For every wish that is satisfied, there remain 10 that are denied. Desire is infinite, fulfillment is limited. It is like the alms thrown to a beggar that keeps him alive today in order that his misery may be prolonged tomorrow. As long as our consciousness is filled by our will, so long as we are given up to the throng of desires with their constant hopes and fears, so long as we are subject to willing, we can never have lasting happiness or peace. And fulfillment never satisfies. Nothing is so fatal to an ideal as its realization. The satisfied passion oftener leads to unhappiness than to happiness, for its demands often conflict so much with the personal welfare of him who is concerned that they undermine it. Each individual bears within himself a disruptive contradiction. The realized desire develops a new desire, and so on endlessly. At the bottom, this results from the fact that the will must live on itself, for there exists nothing besides it, and it is a hungry will. In every individual, the measure of the pain essential to him was determined once for all by his nature, a measure which could neither remain empty nor be more than filled. If a great and pressing care is lifted from our breast, another immediately replaces it, the whole material of which was already there before, but could not come into consciousness as care, because there was no capacity left for it. But now that there is room for this, it comes forward and occupies the throne. Again, life is evil because pain is its basic stimulus and reality, and pleasure is merely a negative cessation of pain. Aristotle was right. The wise man seeks not pleasure, but freedom from care and pain. All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is in reality and essence negative only. We are not properly conscious of the blessings and advantages we actually possess, nor do we prize them, but think of them merely as a matter of course, for they gratify us only negatively by restraining suffering. Only when we have lost them do we become sensible of their value, for the want, the privation, the sorrow is the positive thing, communicating itself directly to us. What was it that led the cynics to repudiate pleasure in any form, if it was not the fact that pain is, in a greater or less degree, always bound up with pleasure? The same truth is contained in that fine French proverb, "Le mieux est l'ennemi du bien." Leave well enough alone. Life is evil because, as soon as want and suffering permit rest to a man, ennui is at once so near that he necessarily requires diversion, i.e., more suffering. Even if the socialist utopia were attained, innumerable evils would be left because some of them, like strife, are essential to life. And if every evil were removed and strife were altogether ended, boredom would become as intolerable as pain. So, life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and ennui. After man had transformed all pains and torments into the conception of hell, there remained nothing for heaven except ennui. The more successful we become, the more we are bored. As want is the constant scourge of the people, so ennui is the scourge of the fashionable world. In middle class, the ennui is represented by the Sundays, and want by the weekdays. Life is evil because the higher the organism, the greater the suffering. The growth of knowledge is no solution. For as the phenomenon of will becomes more complete, the suffering becomes more and more apparent. In the plant, there is as yet no sensibility and therefore no pain. A certain very small degree of suffering is experienced by the lowest species of animal life, Infusoria and Radiata. Even in insects, the capacity to feel and suffer is still limited. It first appears in a high degree with the complete nervous system of vertebrate animals, and always in a higher degree the more intelligence develops. Thus, in proportion as knowledge attains to distinctness, as consciousness ascends, pain also increases and reaches its highest degree in man. And then again, the more distinctly a man knows, the more intelligent he is, the more pain he has. The man who is gifted with genius suffers most of all. He that increaseth knowledge, therefore, increaseth sorrow. Even memory and foresight add to human misery, for most of our suffering lies in retrospect or anticipation. Pain itself is brief. How much more suffering is caused by the thought of death than by death itself? Finally, and above all, life is evil because life is war. Everywhere in nature we see strife, competition, conflict, and a suicidal alternation of victory and defeat. Every species fights for the matter, space, and time of the others. The young hydra, which grows like a bud out of the old one and afterwards separates itself from it, fights while it is still joined to the old one for the prey that offers itself, so that the one snatches it out of the mouth of the other. But the bulldog ant of Australia affords us the most extraordinary example of this kind. For if it is cut in two, a battle begins between the head and the tail. The head seizes the tail with its teeth, and the tail defends itself bravely by stinging the head. The battle may last for half an hour, until they die or are dragged away by the other ants. This contest takes place every time the experiment is tried. Junghans relates that he saw in Java a plain, as far as the eye could reach, entirely covered with skeletons, and took it for a battlefield. They were, however, merely the skeletons of large turtles, which come this way out of the sea to lay their eggs, and are then attacked by wild dogs who, with their united strength, lay them on their backs, strip off the small shell from the stomach, and devour them alive. But often then a tiger pounces upon the dogs. For this these turtles are born. Thus the will to live everywhere preys upon itself, and in different forms is its own nourishment, till finally the human race, because it subdues all the others, regards nature as a manufactory for its own use. Yet even the human race reveals in itself with most terrible distinctness this conflict, this variance of the will with itself, and we find homo homini lupus. The total picture of life is almost too painful for contemplation. Life depends on our not knowing it too well. If we should bring clearly to a man's sight the terrible sufferings and miseries to which his life is constantly exposed, he would be seized with horror. And if we were to conduct the confirmed optimist through the hospitals, infirmaries, and surgical operating rooms, through the prisons, torture chambers, and slave kennels, over battlefields and places of execution, if we were to open to him all the dark abodes of misery where it hides itself from the glance of cold curiosity, and finally allow him to look into the starving dungeons of Ugolino, he too would understand at last the nature of this best of all possible worlds. For whence did Dante take the materials of his hell but from our actual world? And yet he made a very proper hell out of it. But when, on the other hand, he came to describe heaven and its delights, he had an insurmountable difficulty before him, for our world affords no materials at all for this. Every epic and dramatic poem can only represent a struggle, an effort, a fight for happiness, never enduring and complete happiness itself. It conducts its heroes through 1,000 dangers and difficulties to the goal. As soon as this is reached, it hastens to let the curtain fall. For now there would remain nothing for it to do but to show that the glittering goal in which the hero expected to find happiness had only disappointed him, and that after its attainment he was no better off than before. We are unhappy married, and unmarried we are unhappy. We are unhappy when alone, and unhappy in society. We are like hedgehogs clustering together for warmth, uncomfortable when too closely packed, and yet miserable when kept apart. It is all very funny, and the life of every individual, if we survey it as a whole and only lay stress on its most significant features, is really always a tragedy, but gone through in detail it has the character of a comedy. Think of it. At the age of 5 years, to enter a spinning cotton or other factory, and from that time forth to sit there daily, first 10, then 12, and ultimately 14 hours, performing the same mechanical labor, is to purchase dearly the satisfaction of drawing breath. But this is the fate of millions, and that of millions more is analogous to it. Again, under the firm crust of the planet dwell powerful forces of nature, which, as soon as some accident affords them free play, must necessarily destroy the crust and everything living upon it, as has already taken place at least 3 times upon our planet, and will probably take place oftener still. The earthquake of Lisbon, the earthquake of Haiti, the destruction of Pompeii, are only small playful hints of what is possible. In the face of all this, optimism is a bitter mockery of men's woes, and we cannot ascribe to the theodicy of Leibniz, as a methodical and broad unfolding of optimism, any other merit than this, that it gave occasion later for the immortal Candide of the great Voltaire, whereby Leibniz's oft-repeated and lame excuse for the evil of the world, that the bad sometimes brings about the good, received a confirmation which was unexpected by him. In brief, the nature of life throughout presents itself to us as intended and calculated to awaken the conviction that nothing at all is worth our striving, our efforts, and struggles, that all good things are vanity, the world in all its ends bankrupt, and life a business which does not cover expenses.